Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a faculty webinar on in conversation with Nina Schick. I'm Alex Adam. I'm a lead data scientist at faculty, and I'll be moderating today. I'm just going to do a couple of quick bookkeeping things in terms of timing. So we're going to have a sort of conversation together for about the first half an hour, and then there'll be time for a kind of in-depth Q&A for the final 15 minutes. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the talk. I'll be noting them down, and we can go through them in some detail in the final 15 minutes. All right, thanks very much. So I'm just going to do a very quick intro to faculty. So for people who don't know us, we're an artificial intelligence company. We exist to make AI real. We build products and services, and we work in a whole range of different areas. We've worked with over 230 customers in 13 countries, and we cover about 23 sectors now across the entire machine learning space. Now, the reason why we're here today is because we've spent quite a lot of time working in this quite fascinating area of deepfakes. Now, I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page by giving a quick intro to what deepfakes are. And Nina's going to be telling us in a lot more detail about this in the context of her book. So what is a deepfake? So a deepfake is a type of synthetic media in which an individual's likeness is changed for that of another. And that could be in some image, it could be in a video, or it could be in even audio. Now, we usually restrict the term deepfake to refer to that kind of synthetic media that's generated through machine learning. You'll also probably have heard the term shallow fake, which refers to a kind of more traditional tampering techniques. Okay, so many types of deepfakes exist. Here are some examples. You've probably heard of face swapping, where you take someone's face and you put it on another person. You've probably also heard of facial reenactment, where you use another person's expressions to drive a video. There are many other kinds. Here's a deepfake of our CEO transformed into Donald Trump using style transfer. And I won't play this one, but the YouTube link's at the bottom for you to see an audio deepfake that we created for the Copenhagen Democracy Summit of Donald Trump. So there are many different kinds of deepfakes across the space. Now, because there's a huge amount of awareness now surrounding misinformation and disinformation online, it's becoming increasingly important to be able to detect deepfakes. And I guess one message I really want to hit home today is that that's a really hard problem. And I think Nina and I will talk about that in some detail later. Often you find that models that work well on one kind of deepfake don't generalize to others. And compression and things like this can make it a very difficult situation. So at faculty, we've been doing a lot of work on building deepfake detection technology, and we have technology in place that performs very well on detecting quite a wide variety of GAN images, and also quite a wide variety of different kind of facial reenactment images. So I'm just going to leave that there, but if anyone's interested in that, please do reach out to us. We've managed to get pretty strong performances on both GAN detection and face manipulation. As I said, it's a very challenging problem, and there are many unanswered questions, but this is an area where we're deeply interested in as a company. All right, so with that, I'd like to move over now to introduce you to Nina. So I want everyone to give a warm welcome to Nina Schick. So Nina Schick is an author and a broadcaster. She specializes in how technology and artificial intelligence are reshaping society today. So Nina's most recent book on deepfakes, the Coming Infocalypse, it's hard to actually say that word, it's really fascinating. I recommend it to everyone. She talks about the crisis of mis and disinformation, and she warns about how AI-generated synthetic media is really the next evolving threat we should all think about. Now, over the last decade, Nina has gained expertise in geopolitics, emerging technology. She's advised many global leaders, including Joe Biden, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the ex-Secretary General of NATO, on deepfakes. So, welcome, Nina.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right. So, I think we should kick off with you saying why you think deepfakes are interesting. It's very obvious to me and you why deepfakes are interesting, but I think for our viewers, it'd be good to get a flavor for what you think is so fascinating and important about deepfakes.
Well, like Alex already outlined, my background really is in geopolitics. And over the past decade, you can't talk about geopolitics, politics, or society without understanding that emerging technologies are having a massive impact on the future of geopolitics and politics and society. I have been particularly interested in misinformation and disinformation, and how the information ecosystem itself has transformed over the past 10 years. And this is because I've been working, for instance, on the Russian invasion of Eastern Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, on Russian interference in the context of the US election, and various campaigns since about 2013. And when I started working with the former NATO Secretary General on this group of global leaders, I was actually working with faculty as well. And this was at the end of 2017. And some of the team at faculty alerted me to this emerging thing known as a deepfake. And it's really important here, I guess, for the basis of our conversation, just to point out how nascent this ability of AI is to actually generate synthetic or fake media, right? It can be anything. It can be an image, it can be a video, it can be an audio track. And the actual ability of AI to not only manipulate it, but create something from scratch that didn't exist before is, I think, going to completely transform the future of all human communication. But not only that, it can become potentially the most harmful tool of visual disinformation known to humanity. So when I first came to deepfakes at the end of 2017, I was very much coming at it from this angle of disinformation, geopolitics, and what are the next emerging threats. And it was very, very clear, even a few years ago, that this could be a very potentially dangerous weapon, because the AI behind it will democratize the ability for almost anyone to create highly sophisticated visual disinformation, something which until now there was kind of a barrier to entry. So it's going to be ubiquitous, it's coming, and it's going to have severe kind of geopolitical and political ramifications. And that's really why I started writing about it in the context of geopolitics.
And so I guess, would you say this is one of the main reasons that led you to writing your book?
It absolutely is, but you have to think of deepfakes. I mean, they didn't emerge in a vacuum, right? Even before AI got good enough to generate synthetic media, we were already facing an epidemic of mis and disinformation. And a lot of the mis and disinformation we're seeing come in the form of, you can call them shallow fakes or cheap fakes. So kind of authentic media that is somehow manipulated, not with AI, either by being miscontextualized, by being clipped in a certain way, by being crudely edited. And we've seen over the past 10 years how these pieces of visual disinformation have led to severe political consequences. For instance, in places like Myanmar, a country which was basically shut off from the internet until the regime decided to loosen up restrictions in 2014, where suddenly Facebook became the internet almost overnight. The proliferation of cheap fakes, manipulated media, actually helped unleash a genocide against the ethnic minority Rohingya. So we know, if you look at the political context over the last 10 years, how powerful visual disinformation is in the form of cheap fakes or shallow fakes. So now, given that we understand how powerful that is, when you consider what AI is increasingly able to do in the very short to medium term future, it would be silly not to think about the kind of geopolitical consequences of that. So I wrote the book not only looking at deepfakes, but looking at the entire corrosion of the information ecosystem, and how deepfakes are kind of the latest evolving threat in that trend.
I wonder if it's worth sort of just briefly like outlining for everyone sort of what you consider to be sort of the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And also just how would you describe your book to people who haven't read it? If you were to give a soundbite of how you would describe your book, what would you say?
Misinformation and disinformation are essentially both forms of bad information. The difference is the intent. So with disinformation, it's bad information that is spread with the express intention to deceive someone. Misinformation is bad information that's spread sometimes naively. So the person who's spreading it doesn't necessarily have the express intent to deceive someone, but they, genuinely might think that that is a piece of authentic or real information. And when you think about the crisis of bad information we're currently facing in society, both disinformation and misinformation are equally as potent. And COVID-19 is perhaps the perfect case study of that. So with my book, I'm essentially outlining how some of the exponential technological advances of the last 30 years have completely led to this paradigm change in our information ecosystem, to the extent where misinformation and disinformation, which are actually age-old phenomena, right? The internet didn't create it, but they have been able to accelerate to a degree that is unprecedented. And I think that I kind of contextualize how AI is going to make this crisis of bad information, this corroding information ecosystem, which I call the Infocalypse, this ever-evolving kind of state which we all exist in, going to make it worse. And I kind of outline how that is not only playing out between state actors at the geopolitical level, but it's something that is increasingly encroaching upon society, including Western democratic societies. And you only need to think about recent political developments to see that in action, whether that's the US election or what's happened around the pandemic, to how it is actually something that has a real life cost for businesses and individuals as well. So sometimes when we think about disinformation or misinformation, it's easy to think about it as a geopolitical thing that happens between nation states, but actually it has a very real cost to private individuals and all businesses as well.
So I'd kind of be really interested to hear your thoughts on what you think are the most kind of concerning examples of deep fakes that we've really seen today, because I think this is something that I think would be of like major interest to sort of people tuning in today, because I think there is a sense that deep fakes are real now. I think many people believe that they're a real problem, but I think people don't always know just the entire extent of the problem. So I think it'd be interesting to understand what you think are the most concerning examples that exist.
So without a doubt, the most malicious and widespread use of deepfakes to date are in the form of non-consensual pornography. And when faculty first alerted me to the emergence of this kind of new ability of AI to kind of manipulate media and generate fake media at the end of 2017, this was actually when some of the amazing advancements in the AI research community started leaching out, and they emerged of all places on Reddit, where this anonymous user calling himself Deepfakes, hence the name Deepfakes, it's stuck, used some of the open source tools coming out of the AI research community and figured out how to make AI generated fake pornography. So essentially, he took an authentic pornographic film and managed to face swap the face of an actress into that film. And it just went crazy on Reddit. He revealed how he had done it. Other Redditors started doing it. So kind of within weeks, this deepfake porn community on Reddit was shut down. Although it was shut down, the cat was out of the bag. And since then, there has been an entire deepfake pornographic ecosystem that's developed online. Really interestingly, it's an entirely gendered phenomenon. If you look, it's very easily accessible. You can find every celebrity and political figure from Michelle Obama to Ivanka Trump, but it is almost exclusively gendered. However, even though porn is still the most malicious and widespread use of deepfake technology, there is no doubt that this is just the harbinger of what's to come, because essentially what AI is so good at is taking somebody's likeness and almost being able to hijack your biometrics, right? So that can be your digital image. It can also be your voice. When I actually started working with faculty at the end of 2017, it was very hard still to kind of overcome this challenge of using AI to generate voice. It was harder than image. But since then, we've moved along very, very quickly. And now AI can basically be used to almost hijack or recreate your biometrics in any kind of form of media, from audio to video to images. So it's obvious that this is going to become a political weapon. And a lot, I think, of the headlines around deepfakes in the past few years have been about how it's going to become this weapon of disinformation that's going to corrupt and undermine democracy. It has to be said that to date, there haven't been many charismatic deepfakes that have disrupted politics in a very meaningful way. But to me, that is only a sign that the barriers to entry are still higher than people sometimes think when you read kind of articles about the dangers of deepfakes. So the barriers are coming down, so it's only a matter of when, not if. And second, because cheap fakes or shallow fakes, manipulated media that have nothing to do with AI, are already so effective that deepfakes haven't really been the ones that have been doing the damage. And again, you see this both in the context of COVID and in the context particularly of the US election, where the president himself, Donald Trump, was repeatedly using manipulated media and cheap fakes to hunker down on his corrosive narrative that somehow the election had been illegally conducted and subject to widespread voter fraud. So one of the other, I think, even before deepfakes become ubiquitous in the political realm, they already have a corrosive effect in that they enhance something known as the liar's dividend. And this was coined by academics in the context of deepfakes. And the idea is that in a world where everything can be faked, right? Even things that traditionally we've seen as an extension of our own perception, like video, something that's seen as hard, irrefutable evidence, can be faked by AI and be done in such a sophisticated way that to the human eye, it's not going to be distinguishable. Is something synthetic or is it authentic? So in a world where all of that is possible, then everything can be denied. So liars get this double dividend of not only being able to target anyone with synthetic media, but also being able to deny all authentic media. So that is actually the biggest impact of deepfakes we've seen to date. They're not ubiquitous yet in the political realm, but they're already enhancing the liar's dividend. And we've seen some crazy case studies of the liar's dividend playing out in politics across the world already.
I think it would be, interesting to give some examples of that. I mean, I strongly agree. I think the ability for individuals to simply deny that media is true on the suspicion that it could be a deep fake, I think is one of the main reasons why I think deepfake detection technology is going to be very important going forwards, just to be able to assign some measure of truth to content that one sees online or sort of on social media. Just to add to this, I think one thing I find quite remarkable is, neural networks are getting very good for things like pose estimation now. And they're not so well known, but there are examples of deep fakes where you can actually map someone's entire body pose from one video to another. So you've probably seen the kind of Washington University deep fake dancing video, where you can essentially, in the same way that you would do facial reenactment, where you drive someone's expression with another video, you can actually drive someone's kind of entire motion with another video. Now, obviously, that's probably going to be a long way off before we start seeing, dangerous deepfakes in that space, but it's quite amazing what could be possible. I think in terms of the liar's dividend, I think it'd be really interesting to hear some examples. I mean, we mentioned once together, I remember the incident in Gabon in terms of sort of quite terrifying examples of deepfakes in the political space. You mentioned Myanmar as well.
Well, the Gabon story is really fascinating. And this happened at the end of 2018, where the president of Gabon, Ali Bongo, had not been seen in public for quite a few months. And what had happened was that he had actually suffered a stroke whilst he had been abroad in Saudi Arabia. And he, of course, was the kind of heir to a dynasty that had ruled the relatively stable nation for about 50 years. So his allies were trying to keep it on the down low, that he was actually incapacitated. But increasingly, his political rivals, started speculating that he was dead, and political unrest started, bubbling along in the country. So in order to quell this unrest, they decided to get Ali Bongo to do his traditional New Year's Eve address. Now, he looked very odd in this video. His face looked frozen, his eyes were really wide. And basically they started speculating that this was a deep fake of Ali Bongo and that he was actually dead. And what that led to was an attempted coup d'etat just a week later. It failed in the end, and there's an explanation for why he looked so bizarre, because he had actually suffered a stroke and he had probably had plastic surgery and Botox to kind of alleviate some of the effects of the stroke. But the rumor that he was dead and this was a deep fake was enough to essentially kick off a coup. But it also the liar's dividend is also playing out not only in kind of countries like Gabon, but even in Western democracies, right? It's become, because of this kind of epidemic of mis and disinformation, not only with deepfakes, but with the proliferation of other forms of manipulated media. I mean, you literally had the president of the United States using authentic videos of election workers taking ballots into buildings, saying that this was proof that they were somehow tampering with the vote. And this was something that was believed by millions of Americans, to the extent where, you know, we saw what happened on January the 6th with the storming of the Capitol. The people who went there, goaded by the president, believing this narrative that the election had somehow been stolen from them, didn't go there because they thought they were violent insurrectionists. They went there because they thought they were Democrats protecting democracy. Another really interesting example that I saw earlier this year was, I was submitting my manuscript, and it was just as the George Floyd video had come out. And that video was so powerful that it unleashed a movement against racism and police brutality, not only in the United States, but all around the world. And I was thinking, just as I submitted my manuscript, well, it won't be long before a video like this, which is now powerful enough to unleash this global movement, is going to be decried as fake. And sure enough, it was only 2 weeks later when Dr. Winnie Armstrong, she is an African-American PhD holding verified Republican candidate standing for the House, released a 24-page document saying that the entire George Floyd video is a deepfake hoax, and that his face was actually swapped onto the body of a former NBA player. And she, you know, this was not some crazy lunatic on some fringe website. This is a woman who's got a PhD, who's standing for the House. And, you know, in the context of 2020, it didn't get that much traction. Deepfake researchers like myself obviously noticed this. But in 2024, or in 2026, or in 2030, when synthetic media and other forms of manipulated media are ubiquitous to the extent that we no longer have a grasp on what's real or what's not, the danger is that you use your own biases or political allegiances to basically interpret what's the truth. And I thought that was a very, very interesting case study of what is probably likely to happen again in the polarized political environment of the United States and other countries.
Ultimately, the ability to essentially align whatever media you want with your own beliefs by simply denying that it's real, saying it's kind of manipulated. Yeah, it's kind of quite worrying. I think that kind of brings me naturally onto my kind of next question, which is, what do you think that technology companies and big tech could actually do to help in this space?
They have to be players, not least because they are kind of the new power brokers in this new information ecosystem, where they're kind of the gatekeepers when it comes to deepfakes in particular, because they have almost got this mythical kind of sexy status. So many headlines have been written about it because the idea, you know, that you can use AI to hijack someone's biometrics or to fabricate something in its entirety that never existed before is quite compelling to the public. So you saw, for example, Facebook launching the Deepfake Detection Challenge. I think faculty actually entered into that competition where they released a data set. They allowed people to kind of use that training data to try and develop deepfake detection models. I think Amazon was also involved in that, if I'm not, is that right, Alex? In that,
I think Amazon as well.
But I would argue that deepfake seems to be something that the tech companies seem to be addressing, just because it has such a hold on the public imagination. But as I already mentioned, when you look at deepfakes in the context of the corroding information ecosystem and the damage done by cheap fakes, you know, you can't just look at deepfakes in isolation. What we're talking about here is a much bigger problem. What we need to address is shoring up the integrity of the information ecosystem itself. In an ideal world, you would want to have tech companies or social media companies almost at the point of entry. So whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter, have the kind of detection technology inbuilt to their platform. So any kind of manipulated or synthetic media can automatically be flagged because it's going to be too much work for moderators. Of course, there's a lot of gray spaces there as well. How do you define synthetic media that's being used for comedy or for satire? How do you flag that up? But then a second thing that tech companies and industry can do is also work on authentication of provenance of authentic media. And it's been very interesting to see how Adobe has been leading initiative here in conjunction with the New York Times and Twitter's, where they're actually working on building into the hardware of devices almost like a provenance methodology for any media to always be able to be authenticated as real. So this would be a very useful tool to journalists or human rights activists. So there's two ways in which you can look at the problem: detecting fake media, and then also always being able to use kind of tech solutions to provide the provenance of authentic media.
And sort of in addition to tech, what do you think kind of governments sort of might want to think about doing to kind of help in this space? I think particularly in the context of the sort of interest in online harms protection, for example, in this country, I wonder if there is specific advice that you might give to sort of government officials or kind of government more generally in that area.
Well, I think governments can't afford to ignore this challenge. I would argue that, the corroding information ecosystem is one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, as big as climate change. And you cannot look at the problem of misinformation or disinformation or deepfakes in isolation. You have to see it as this broader paradigm change in the actual information ecosystem, right? If you consider some of the huge technological advances that have changed the ways that humans communicated, there's always been societal ramifications. If it hadn't been for the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press, then the European Reformation wouldn't have followed, and the course of world history would look entirely different. However, what's different now is the pace of acceleration is so fast. There were 4 centuries between the invention of the printing press and everything that happened to the invention of modern photography. But in the past 30 years, we've had the internet, we've had social media, we've had smartphones, and now we're entering into the age of synthetic media. So it is absolutely essential for governments to understand that this is the paradigm change in our information ecosystem, and the ways that we are communicating as humans is going to impact everything in politics and society. So I think just the understanding that what we're looking at here is not a problem with disinformation or just deepfakes. This is a paradigm shift. So how do we update our legislation, our society, the way we govern to be in tune with this new reality?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that sentiment. I remember back in 2017 when we were first speaking to kind of government about deepfakes, I think people were almost somewhat skeptical about the true extent that this problem would actually become. And I think people are now starting to really realize like the extent to which this represents, as you say, a paradigm shift in the way of thinking. So I think for the remaining 15 minutes, I'm going to shift to the Q&A. So we've already got some questions from the audience. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read them out and we can sort of take them together. So the first question is, so you said that a problem of deepfakes is the democratization of the ability to make convincing fakes. So why is that worse than the ability being concentrated among a small number of powerful groups, e.g. state intelligence agencies or well-funded political parties?
It's worse because it potentially just means that there are more bad actors, right? So if you look at sophisticated visual disinformation, if you look at the history in the 20th century, one proponent of rewriting the historical record as for a tool of disinformation and propaganda was none other than Joseph Stalin. And what they did in the 20th century was basically manipulate photographs, right? So whenever he went through his pogroms in the 1930s, where his opponents were basically wiped out, a lot of the photographs of the people who disappeared under Stalin's regime were later completely unpersoned from the historical record by being removed from photographs. However, in order to do that then, he basically developed this cottage industry of these craftsmen who are very sophisticated, manipulating these photographs by hand. It was expensive, it took a lot of effort, And only somebody like a Joseph Stalin or a state actor had the resources to do this. If you think about the trajectory of synthetic media and the type of fidelity of fake media that AI is going to be able to create, the only thing that is comparable now or recently would have been visual effects done by the best Hollywood studios or a state actor with a lot of resources. So you need to have a multi-million-dollar budget. You need to have teams of experts. You need to have a lot of resource. And now what we're seeing is that in the next 5 to 10 years, even a YouTuber will be able to create something that previously was only in the realm of a dictator or a Hollywood studio. So given that we have this new information ecosystem where anybody can spread anything to a global audience within seconds, that potentially just means that this democratization of bad information is going to lead to far more disinformation. So it's, for that reason, it's very, very dangerous. Anyone can spread it.
Yeah, very strongly agree with all of that. And I think one thing I'd add is I think one thing that kind of shallow fakes have shown us is that actually you don't need to have a small group of extremely dedicated deep fakers making high fidelity deep fakes to cause, you know, damage in the kind of misinformation, disinformation space. It's actually more than sufficient to have some fairly low quality deep fakes on the right social media channels, and that can certainly cause a huge amount of disruption. All right, so the next question. I assume it's harder to detect a low resolution deep fake. What could the impact be on using CCTV as evidence, for example? So I can actually take that one. So we've done a lot of internal work at faculty on deepfake detection, and you're absolutely correct. So compression in particular, any kind of JPEG compression, can dramatically destroy the kind of machine learning classifiers that you would traditionally train on these kind of deepfake detection problems. Basically, the reason for that is they tend to focus on high frequency information. So they tend to focus on very, very low level microscopic features, sometimes learning signals that are very specific to the noise patterns that these deepfake algorithms actually end up having in them. And that's actually a really big challenge. So trying to make sure that the machine learning models you train for deepfake detection, they focus on kind of macroscopic human interpretable features rather than features that are very likely to be destroyed by compression. But the vast majority of deepfake algorithms you'll find out there will not be robust to compression. And I think that is one of the big outstanding problems in deepfake detection. So we've made some progress on that internally. I'm happy to talk about that offline. So whoever asked that question, you should feel very free to reach out to us. The top line is we can do GAN detection quite well on very compressed images. Actual facial manipulations are harder compressed, but we have also made progress there. Okay, next question. So isn't there a risk that an HW embedded provenance mechanism will dangerously expose citizen journalists and whistleblowers?
Yes, but you have to ask yourself, so with the initiative that Adobe is leading on media provenance, right now, it's very kind of, they opt in, you know, they hope to make it an industry standard. But there is a risk, as you mentioned, but I mean, ultimately, I think, how else are we going to tackle this endemic of mis and disinformation? And I think when you look at technical solutions, the only two broad ways you can look at it is through media provenance and detection. And interestingly, a lot of journalists have actually been welcoming of the idea of media provenance because they find then they don't have to go out and kind of make the argument that, oh no, this is an authentic video when they're accused of being biased. They can just say, let the technology do the talking. So yeah, there are risks to weigh up, but yeah, it's just the reality.
Agreed. So is part of the problems with deepfakes that when it is discussed, the language used is often inaccessible and overly euphemistic, e.g. you referred to sort of non-consensual pornography. Why not just say what it is, like false sexually abusive imagery? Do you think this would democratize and widen the discussion?
Yeah, and I think there's actually a really important discussion to be had around the taxonomy around synthetic media. And I think in part, this is because it's such a new and emerging field. Again, remember, it's only kind of in the last 5 to 7 years that these breakthroughs with regards to AI actually being able to manipulate and then synthetically generate from scratch media, fake media or manipulated media. One thing I think that is also important to point out is that it's not only going to be used for bad. Synthetic media is going to completely transform the way that we interact with media in the future. It's going to rewrite entire industries. When you think about the entertainment industry, fashion, film, video games, AI is going to completely change all of that. So I think when it comes to talking about taxonomy, we also need to distinguish that this powerful technology is just going to be an amplifier of human intention. So just as it will be weaponized by bad actors and used maliciously, and we can, debate, whether we should call it non-consensual porn or AI-based image abuse, it's also important to distinguish that there will be many commercial, practical, and genuinely social good applications of synthetic media. This is why in my book, I kind of make the distinction between deepfakes, which is already kind of got this negative connotation, as the use of synthetic media for the purposes of mis and disinformation, and then synthetic media itself as a term which doesn't necessarily have any negative connotations. But yeah, absolutely, with regards to non-consensual pornography, it is a new type of virtual abuse, right? This is something that we need to rethink how we think about revenge porn, because essentially with deepfake porn, you're talking about an act of violence against somebody who wasn't even necessarily involved in the act, who had their image taken away in a way that they didn't consent to. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just sort of to add to that, I think on the kind of positive applications of deepfakes, people often kind of forget this, but deepfakes are being used for a lot of pretty amazing applications in special effects these days. I know Framestore have recently started using similar synthetic media generation technology in their pipelines. So it's definitely not as simple as a kind of a blanket ban on any kind of synthetic media. But I agree that sort of changing the language around kind of non-consensual porn to just online abuse could be an important step in making the relevant people in government kind of aware of the extent of the problem. So this, I think, is a really interesting question from someone here. So how do we get people to trust deepfake detection algorithms? If someone dismisses an incriminating video as a deepfake, why do we suppose that people would just believe the algorithm, as opposed to their own ideological views? And I think this is really fascinating. I mean, I think my perspective on that one is that I think the answer is sort of machine learning explainability here. Like, if you're going to have a machine prediction for why you think an image is fake, you had better make sure that you're able to explain in detail why your algorithm is telling you that it's fake. So if you are able to identify that, say, you think there's a blending region in the image, that would then allow humans to go in and actually explore that carefully by eye and validate that, oh yes, there is a blending region. Certainly, I think a black box model that just simply says this is fake won't be useful in deepfake detection. That would be my take on that.
And the reality is probably in political discourse, when things tend to go wrong, increasingly we're going to see politicians blaming the algorithm, right? We saw that with the whole school exams fracas earlier last year. And presumably we'll see that with deepfake detection when synthetic media becomes ubiquitous, when people actually try to undermine the veracity of the algorithm because they have a political motivation to say a piece of media is synthetic or authentic. And I think ultimately that's why we have to conceive of the problem as being one that's only fixed or addressed through many layers. So you think of deepfake detection or media provenance as technical solutions to a huge problem that's going to need a lot of kind of society-wide resilience building as well. So they're not the silver bullet answer in this really complicated new information ecosystem, but they're part of the solution.
Absolutely. So who do you think should be responsible for identifying and removing deepfakes? Technology platforms, governments, new regulators, or a combination or a group of these and more?
So there is no one actor who can be responsible. You have to take a networked approach to kind of shoring up the integrity of the information ecosystem. And also there's no one size fits all model. In some cases, it's very easy to be like, okay, this is obviously a very harmful deepfake, like non-consensual pornography, it should be removed. However, there's going to be a lot of gray areas as well, right? So what about political satire? Who gets to decide whether a piece of synthetic media that's being used as political satire, whether that's harmful or not, and whether that should be removed or not? And this is really why this is such a difficult conversation. And I wish I could say, this is the answer. This is the person, this is the company, this is the government, and this is what the government needs to do in terms of regulation. But it's actually the start of a very interested and long debate about freedom of speech, online harms, your image being abused in ways that was not possible before. So there is no simple answer to that. And when it comes to building resilience to not only deepfakes, but all kinds of visual disinformation, it only works when you have a networked approach. So governments have a role to play, but so do the tech platforms, but so does civil society. There's no one actor that takes overbearing responsibility.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I'll take this question here. So you mentioned the pornography example, which kind of shows how rapid the learning cycle is. But so academics have recently published a paper that sort of illustrated the risks of the kind of GPT-3, so this text generation model, as a radicalization tool. So have you encountered any applications of kind of deep fakes in the extremism or kind of terrorism context? And what are your views on this and how to raise awareness without inadvertently equipping or actually inspiring bad actors?
So no, I haven't come across any visual kind of, so video or image deepfakes for the purposes of terrorism or extremism. However, with GPT-3, I think you're referring to this study that was done by the Middlesbrough Institute on terrorism, where they found that GPT-3 could be prompted to basically generate sways of extremist content, which could be used to radicalize people. And we know that even though visual disinformation is very powerful when it comes to radicalization, even text can be very, very, very powerful. So I think there's two different things here, right? The visual side of deepfakes and then text generation, and whether that can also be considered a deepfake. But I don't think we're there yet in terms of seeing them in the wild, but I have no doubt that increasingly as the barriers to entry come down, I mean, with GPT-3, that model only came out last year, we will start seeing them in the wild, and I think they will be used for extremism and terrorism. I don't think we're there yet. I just saw that paper as well on GPT-3 and I was really alarmed by it. But no, I think it's such an emerging issue that there hasn't even been that much debate about it. So I'm really impressed at whoever asked the question that they even came across that paper, because it's quite a niche area still.
I think we have time for one more question. There's some really outstanding questions here, so I just want to apologize that we haven't been able to get through all of them. You should totally feel free to just reach out to faculty if you're interested in this space, and we'll do our best to answer any other questions. So I think the final question for today is sort of, legal frameworks will never move as fast as this technology. What more agile mechanisms should we draw on to achieve consensus and effective intervention across the ecosystem? I think this is a really important point, actually. Like, the legal status of many things in machine learning is unclear. Even, for example, who owns the rights to trained models that were trained on a given data set? So I strongly agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the spirit of that question, and I don't have the answer is my answer, but just to give you an example of how challenging this is, when you look at deepfake pornography, for instance, if you are a victim of deepfake pornography, we found in some places that it was so difficult to get that pornography removed that the best chance you had was for the actual film company that made the porn film to lodge a copyright complaint that somehow their film had been manipulated in a way that they didn't consent to, rather than the person who was featured in the deepfake porn film to say, this is my image being abused without my consent. This is a form of violence against me. So I think it's inevitable, especially when you consider just how quickly these advancements are coming and just how quickly this is accelerating, that legal frameworks are going to lag behind. And we're already seeing that around deepfake porn, which at least there is a conversation about legal frameworks around that in the context of revenge porn. But there's so many applications, other applications of synthetic media that are coming quickly. For instance, now we're also starting to see some very charismatic use cases of synthetic media in fraud, that we just, haven't been able to regulate against. And this has really been the story of the last 10 years or last 20 years with the internet. How do you keep up your legislative frameworks with the pace of change and new ways of doing things? And I think a more agile mechanism, that is exactly what we need to start thinking about. And ideally it would be transnational. However, you need buy-in for that. Yeah. And that's really the challenge.
Very challenging. All right, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. And on behalf of everyone at faculty, Nina, thank you so much for this. It's been a fantastic morning.
Thank you all.